To say this is I wrote a book on Zoom several weeks ago, and so um, that's I'm going to start with ancient technology and move to more modern stuff. And Ken had mentioned that may be interested in a lot of other topics that I've covered, and so I'll do my presentation, and then we can talk about it. We can talk about type. I can answer questions about Zoom. One of my favorite tips about Zoom, by the way, is the space bar on desktop Zoom. And depending on the mode you're in, if you have two monitors and you're in two screen mode, this doesn't always work. But if you're in single screen mode on a desktop computer, if you're muted, you can hold down the space bar, and while you hold down the space bar, it turns off mute and then you release it. So it's a great interactive tool. And so that's partly me saying, if you'd like to use the chat for questions if you want. If you want to jump in, this can be very informal. I have slides prepared, and I don't know the level of everyone's typographic expertise and interest, so I'll go with it, and then stop me if you need a little more background about something, because I've got some visual aids handy too at times if we want to talk about some of them, like linotype slug, just with the interest. It was funny, Ken was mentioning phototype, and I'm like, well, I just happen to have some phototype behind me because I've been collecting phototype as part of this project I'm on. So as a experienced Zoom user, I'm going to share my presentation from a separate computer entirely, because, let's see, did that work? Everyone can see the presentation? Yeah? Good, okay, good. Because this lets me actually see all of you in one screen and see my notes and present, so I can kind of have a sense of what's going on all at once. So I thought this might be an interesting topic. Ken had asked me about things that I might talk about, and I kind of like this one because it's I call it Peck of Points, and I'll get into details about all of this. But I'm really interested in the variety of things that we do today that we don't know exactly why we do. And I always find that fascinating what the historical antecedents are. And the most famous one is, and you've probably all heard this story. If you haven't, here's one you can. It's a great, like, sort of non-joke joke, which is a woman's making a ham at Thanksgiving or something, and her husband walks up and says, "Why do you cut the ends off the ham?" And she said, I don't know, maybe it makes it juicier. It's what my mom always did. And then there's another holiday, and the woman says, "Mom, why did you cut the ends off the ham?" She says, "I don't know, let's go ask Grandma." And Grandma said, "The pan was only this big." And I don't know, I love that story because it's like a genuine, it's the oral tradition of a family, but it's also, why do we do things and we don't know? Sometimes it's because we do them and we keep doing them. So that's kind of what this introductory talk is about. It's how 19th century standardization keeps on trucking, or for those of you with some print history, keeps on double trucking, maybe. Oops, I gotta remember which computer to hit the right button on here. So I'll tell you more in a second about how I got down this track. Let me, I'm sorry, one moment. But I was gonna tell you just a tiny bit about myself. Ken gave me a great introduction. I kind of live in two parts. On the left, you can see a series of the computer books I've written in the last couple of years, some of them just the three of them this year alone. There's a lot of demand for things. The home security cameras book, I have to point out, I wrote before the pandemic. It doesn't seem quite as important right now when we're all home to be worried about home security cameras, but you may install them at the office. But Working from Home Temporarily is a free book that my publisher and I agreed to produce because it just felt like we needed to do something for folks who were suddenly forced out of the office, had never worked from home before, and I had a lot of experience with it. I talked to a couple dozen colleagues and other take control authors, and we kind of I put together this guide with their advice and help about just kind of making that adjustment. And so that was a fun thing to do. And then, of course, Zoom took over everyone's lives, so I wrote a book about Zoom, of course. And then on the right side of the slide, you can see some of my other projects, my typographic projects. I always had an interest in type since I was a teenager, early teens. My dad used to sell display advertising in a weekly newspaper, and I caught the type bug. And so even as I kind of was moving my way into technology fields and working for some tech companies and starting one, I eventually found my way to journalism on the one side, but never lost my love of type and design. So in the last few years, I've wound up writing a few books that I've self-published. London Kerning, that was a book about there's a couple great type institutions in London that preserve the past there, and 6 Centuries of Type and Printing. That one with the green cover is a book that was letterpress printed in the north of England the type was set rather in the north of England. It was letterpress printed in London. It was bound in Germany and shipped through the pandemic in April to Seattle as part of a project in which I'm making 100 tiny type museums. That's the picture of which is at the far right, which are collections of genuine type artifacts, modern and historic. And that's been kind of one of my big projects this last, well, now year and a half. Was supposed to be completed earlier this year, had some delays because of all the shutdowns, but that's going to be a big hunk of that is going to be completed soon. And the idea of that is I wanted to preserve some of type's history because it seems like we're in an age where, even though it may seem like a lot has already been lost, we already made big transitions in printing, and everything is digital. There's actually still a lot more out there, institutions and collections and people, and the people are moving on. An operation and Ballard just sold off all of its type. It's going to be preserved. It'll be used elsewhere, but it was connected to Annie's art, and they had a letterpress printing operation, and it just didn't prove viable in the face of the pandemic to keep running it. But that collection won't be broken up. But I see a lot of instances of the stuff going away. So I kind of want to preserve both the knowledge of the past year of what's led us to where we are, but also create these collections that are, like, I call them the Tiny Type Museum and Time Capsule, because I feel like the people buying them they're using them often for teaching purposes, but the collections will persist into the future and be part of what preserves this history is going to be these collections people have. So we won't forget everything, but it'll be a little bit of, moving forward as we go. So this topic I wound up kind of picking because a friend of mine who works in digital interface design and app design at a company that helps develop prototyping tools, he asked me about the nature of vertical type alignment and interline spacing. And that wound up putting me on the path. I did a little research for him, and that wound up putting me on the path of asking a question, which was something I'd wondered about. And if we're in the modern era, this idea of how type lines up vertically, horizontally, spaces between it, it's a totally different question. But I'd often wondered this in reading about the history of type is, how did standards develop? How could you have all these different independent type foundries all carving their own type and casting it, and have it all work together? And the answer was you didn't. That was the answer, and it should be apparent because it was it was not printing arises starting in the 1450s, and the Industrial Revolution doesn't come for centuries, and so there's a whole era in which you have a lack of standardization, and it means that it's very hard as a printer to use type from different foundries, or if you might be making your own type, you might be getting type at different times from different sources, and trying to use it together was actually difficult. And the baseline is kind of the thing that I point to. This diagram shows you a lot of different common aspects of type, but the baseline to me is like one of the key issues, because just lining stuff up on that line, that is a really hard problem. And in the Latin alphabet and in many other scripts, uh, every line of type is always lined in something. The bottom of the capital and the lowercase letters, excluding the descenders that go below the line, there's always some kind of line, right? And that invisible line is kind of I would say, a signature of printing and writing. And some two-fisted presentation here. So it goes, it has a long history. It's not. All right. Okay, let me start resharing this. Let's see.
Sorry about that, everybody.
Okay, should just be able to restart from. All right, I was talking about the baseline, right? Oh yeah, so the baseline. So the baseline it proceeds throughout the history of writing. It's whatever scribe hand you're using. I'm showing Western scripts, but you can go back and see there's always in scripts that were written left to right and right to left. Some were written ambidextrously, some were written top to bottom. There's always a line that's followed in scripts that write with that are always in a left to right motion or right to left motion. There's always a line. So this is an example here from a scribal hand where they've scribed out a line that you can see, and the type progresses along it. it's something that's progressed along from every era of type, that as things move along, you still preserve a baseline. It's something we think about every era. And this is, metal type from the late 1800s. Uh, you go into phototype that Ken was mentioning at the outset, and the whole point of phototype was to figure out how could you get light reflected in such a way that you can have this solid line, things where it's an even line you work with. And the same thing, you move into the digital era, it's the same problem, is how do we keep this baseline? But I like to run back here. Let's go back to the beginning of this period and say, this quote is from writer Talbot Baines Reed, who wrote a book called A History of the Old English Letter Foundries. And I feel like this is kind of was a interesting introduction to me for this issue, was that um, earlier printers, before there was standardization that happens towards the end of the 1800s, before there's the machine tools, the interoperability, the speed of printing increases, all of these things reach an industrial scale. Everything in printing speeds up across the 1800s. Before that, you have these printers who just had to invent everything as they go. So they knew kind of how you made type, because type became a reproducible process. Gutenberg invented a way to do it fairly consistently, or it's believed, or at least shortly after Gutenberg. And so a lot of people know how to make type, make individual pieces of metal type, but making them so that they are part of a system doesn't make any sense at that time, because no one's working at that scale. It's all cottage printing. Printers are often publishers. They may also be typecasters. So it's when you get this kind of differentiation of profession that you, wait, is this showing the whole? I'm sorry. Do you see the whole? No, it's doing something funny. One second here. It should do. Well, I guess that's as good as, it's not, well, I guess that's as good as I can get with that, the slide. I don't know why it's not showing the whole thing. But
More
anyway,
to it.
so,
I see the whole quote surrounded by white space.
oh, you're not seeing, do you see the interface? No, you're not. At the top? All right, let's go. I'm sorry, I don't need to interrupt myself for that. But um, so the notion is that it's as you move into this industrial era that you need interchangeability. Like with so many things, you need a way that one foundry's work works with another foundry's. And um, uh, in the period of time that I'm talking about here, as we before the late 1800s, you have everything kind of all over the place. There's no standard baseline, so type moves all over the place. If you set type from two different fonts, two different, like, actually sizes of type from the same foundry, they might not line up. If you set fonts from two different foundries, they definitely aren't going to line up. There's no precisely standardized size or a point system. Points meant different things in different countries. They still sort of do today, but there's a lot more standardization. And there weren't standard widths either. So it wasn't even a way to, when you're trying to justify a line of type, that literally had to be done by hand. So you're adding spaces or parts of spaces, word spaces, to get something to become flush left and right. And um, without standard widths, so if your M is not some number of units compared to an I, then the amount of time it took for a typesetter to compose a line that was justified, it was an enormous undertaking. It was a big pain for them. So none of these things were standardized, and all the things we take for granted today. And I like pointing out some of the fun aspects of that. So these are the names of type sizes in the pre-font or pre-point era. So there are all these, what I would say, like picturesque or picaresque, maybe even, just to make the bad joke, type names. So you have Pearl, Brevier, Long Primer, Double Pica, Minion, Bourgeois, Diamond, and every country has its own translation of it, or sometimes an entirely different name for the same size. So if you're moving among countries or buying type from different countries, you don't know. And all of these meant things to the printers. These are like guild-like operations that then turned into union or shop-like operations. So they all know what this means, but it's a lot to take in. And again, it's a lot to deal with standardization. This comes from uh, a book written earlier by that author I was mentioning, who was writing about English Type Foundry. This is a comparison across almost 2 centuries of how many characters, how many pieces of type would fit into a foot. So how could you measure type? And with the same type name, so you see like English or pica at the left, and across different authors across almost 2 centuries, what each of them said, that size actually worked out to when you measured it. And that, of course, assumed you had a standard foot. And in England, there wasn't necessarily, the foot might have 12 inches, but were all the 12 inches the same? There wasn't that degree of precision either. So I'm just trying to imagine trying to find a calibrated ruler and then do all this counting and all the rest. So the pearl size near the bottom, I just like to emphasize this when you think about how typesetters were working in these handset days. That's 140 characters, or 140, I think it was M's to the foot. This is about 4.5 points by today's standards. And I want you to consider a typesetter setting a newspaper at 1 a.m. in 4.5 point type for legal notices with sputtering candlelight or kerosene light, and how and the slowly asphyxiating from the fumes because they preferred kerosene instead of even when electrical light became available. That is what that profession was about. By the 1800s, though, we started to see a little bit of settling in this, and you start to get to what we think of as the modern era, measurements we use fairly closely today. France led with something they called Didot points. The Didot family was a multi-generational, long-running printing family in France, and they developed a lot of technology, set a lot of standards, and their point was slightly different than what emerged as a standard American and British point. So I included a couple quotes here from books from the 1800s. So a point was about 1/72 of an inch in America and in the UK, and that is 0.013837 of an inch, right? And today it's slightly different. In desktop publishing, the decision was made that it's exactly 1/72 of an inch to make sure units are consistent. So if you compare letterpress points and modern points, I think it's 0.004 inches different, or 4 thousandths of an inch difference between this very small measurement that was used by printers and the one we use today. The Didot point was slightly different. That was, yeah, 0.014802, and those are still used. And so in American and British systems, we use points, and there are 12 points to a pica and 6 picas to an inch. Didot, they use points, and there's a Cicero, which is 12 points, and then a different amount. They don't measure them to the inch in the same way. So that system's still in use. I've met people who they work in Didot points and they work in Ciceros, and you have to convert even today when you're discussing digital technology. So this is kind of the horror of what things were. So this is an example from a book that taught printing. It was a book about hand setting type intended for students. And this page is supposed to be the horror of it all from about the early 1920s, is imagine trying to set all these different fonts together, and you look at the baseline goes up and down like you're at sea. And that is what they were trying to resolve. So um, one of the reasons that this developed into a problem, obviously, as I say, was this mechanization, the increased speed, the interest in producing typeset copy faster, but then there was also competition. You had in the 1880s, you have the linotype rise, which is the first effective, fast, mechanical, hot metal typesetting system where you have a keyboard operator who's typing away and it produces solid slugs of type, and all of that is perfectly lined up, and the different fonts from linotype could be designed to work interchangeably with a single line. It got more and more sophisticated, so they developed their system that you could set many fonts at once. I'll show you a picture in a second. Around 1900, the monotype system developed, which used a totally different approach for casting type. It was much more like a modern system in that it was one of the first uses of punch type. An operator sat at a keyboard and it punched out paper tape, which was fed into a casting system. And as it read it, like a computer algorithm, it would put the right mold to be cast at the right moment and cast each letter individually. But again, these were designed to be regular, high production environment in newspapers for certain kinds of advertising and for books. So you had to have this similar baseline. You have all the characteristics be the same. And this is where you get, then the standardization of points becomes very uniform as you reach the end of the 1800s. You get standardization of widths, and I'm including here is the slide of from a monotype book on monotype composition by the Monotype Company, explaining how they have different standard units that have to fit in different parts of how they organize the molds from which the type is cast in hot metal. It's an absolute requirement. They can't have anything fuzzy, and they can't have 50 different incremental widths. They have to have a set of standard units that are increased slightly. And I love this picture. This is the 4-magazine linotype, very fancy device. Not even that late in Monotype's development. It's still early 1900s, I believe, by that point. And the notion is, you think about, remember the original Macintosh and how many fonts we had. This is competing with that. The linotype had a 4-magazine linotype. Each magazine had a series of channels, each of which had separate pieces of type for each letter, piece of punctuation. They could have two different pieces, two different letters, like upper and lowercase, or two different fonts on a single matrix, which is the mold used for casting in each magazine. So 4 magazines could hold 8 fonts, and with extensions and so forth, you could have, I forget the total is, this is 720 characters with this particular model. And again, you think back to the very first Macintosh, I don't remember the exact character set on those, but I'm not sure that the Mac fully exceeded what a linotype could do. It did very shortly after, if it didn't at its introduction, but this was the competition. Well, Ken has a question. Yeah.
Glenn, what was the year that we're talking about for this machine?
The 4-magazine linotype, I'm trying to remember the exact year on that. I think that was in the 1910s or 20s, not the late 1800s, because linotype gradually, it started, should point out too something funny I discovered not that long ago is linotype used a binary system. It actually had a 7-bit binary system by which the correct matrix, it's in these huge magazines, each with a separate channel. When you typed, a matrix would kind of fall out of the channel. It would go along a path and line up with its partners. And then when the operator finished a line, they'd essentially pull a handle, and it would cast a line of type like that, a solid, it's easier to see on this side, a solid line, a slug. And then after it cast that, it would want to return these molds back up to the top of this magazine. And it did it by having a series of channels cut into each matrix, and it was a 7-bit code. And so a device would carry the matrix up to the top, and it would jiggle along until the right kinds of notches hit the right spot, and it would drop down correctly, sort of like a pachinko machine, if you've seen those. Sort of had that effect of like chicka 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 stuff, noises and the sound. It's a very loud thing. So an operator is typing away, they finish a line, they hit a button, hot metal comes gushing out, they pull another thing, the matrices are driven up by a drive shaft, they start tinkling down, and the operator is setting the next line. And this is this incredible mechanical achievement. It's amazing to see in operation. There's still actually a number of them in operation around the US and in some places in the world. So the linotype is, like a Macintosh, it made it easy for you to mix and match typefaces. You could, I think font DA mover, if anyone remembers that, was maybe an easier way to install a font than to pick up something that weighed 75 pounds and slot it into the right thing. But the concept is nearly identical. And it made a lot of sense also when you're in this environment and you're mixing and matching fonts. The baselines all need to be the same. So this is kind of the a moment from this is from 1894 in a trade magazine, the Inland Printer. It's R. Coupland Harding written a series of columns about industry standards. Everybody in the industry was trying to push it, and he was sort of delighted to say that the baseline had standardized. This one company in Chicago, Inland, was a type foundry. Chicago and St. Louis were big centers of type founding in the 1800s. They had a huge fire. They lost almost everything. So when they rebuilt and they recreated their type, they said, we're doing it all on a standard line, is what they called it. And the standard line was one baseline. So everything they made, all the type they carved, all the type they set, had a single line across all the different typefaces, and it meant everything set by hand could be mixed and matched. It was a huge innovation. And then you see here, this is 1902 in the British Printer, it's a British trade journal. and you can see they are demonstrating how all these different points are perfectly composed and aligned. There's no reason to have to do a lot of fancy, fussy work by hand that takes a lot of time. It just all works. It's you know, we're kind of in a Steve Jobs moment. It just works, right? We don't have to fuss or mess at all. Um, and the other innovation, the fact that all fonts now used by this period as well, use point size numbers, and foundries had kind of all agreed among themselves and with the big purchasers of type, you know, again, like newspapers and book publishers, job shops that would do stationery, anyone setting type, because you had the standardization for point size, it meant that if you wanted to do anything fancy, like move your type up or down, have an inset cap, you see in this, the standard line examples where they have this inset box, you can use standard widths of literally lead that come in point sizes. So now anything you want to do fits into a grid because you're working with even units of point sizes and everything has the same baseline. There's one other piece here too. I talked about this a bit earlier, which is the set width, or the width of a piece of type in a line. It's something obviously we still deal with today. And this quote is oh, I didn't credit the source here, but this is about the late 1800s. Was Lynn Boyd Benton was the inventor of a number of different technologies that advanced the ability to make metal type very quickly, to make large quantities of new typefaces and new characters, and produce the kind of flow of the molds used for casting type and linotypes and monotypes and hand type at the scale that was then needed for industry. And part of what his theory was, how he got started in the industry, he was not a type person, he was kind of a mechanically minded person. He said, wouldn't it be faster to set type if every character was an even number of units from one system? Because then, as I was saying earlier, a hand setter, before we have these hot metal systems, hand setter is sitting there dropping pieces of type one at a time in. If the widths are all variable, they could be, you know, your units are hundreds of units, and so your M is, you know, 499 units and your I is 33, that they're not even simple units like 1 to 18, and everything is an equal width of that unit, then it's much harder to set the type by hand. So he had this idea, let's create something that was called like self-spacing type is what he called it, because it took so much less time. It felt to the typesetter that the type actually set itself in the right widths, that it actually justified and looked good. And it could reduce the amount of time it took to typeset a line by, I think it was as much as 30%, because there's so much fussing around going. And then it was easier to take that type and put it back in the type cases after you'd printed something and needed to use it the next time as well.
Len,
Yes.
Is this the example you have on the screen? Was this done in the self-spacing type?
Yeah, that was his thing. It was funny. He was not a very good type designer.
Crappy. It's kind of, I mean, the last line.
Is this spaced? No, well, I don't know who. Yeah, oh, I'm sorry. Is this type example self-spaced? That's hilarious. I have no idea how it was set. That's a very good question.
You've got the sort of two spaces after a period. The last line where he's got all the room in the world is kind of crammed together.
Crunched in. No, that's an excellent question. It was probably set by. Actually, it's really terribly set, isn't it?
Yeah,
as really. You said. The spacing though, like, don't get me off into my spacing conversation. A huge space, an M space, or the width of the capital letter M, was the traditional space after a period until the early 1900s. Oh, okay. If you look at any book, go on Google Books and find the whole small space after a period argument we have today versus two spaces on typewriters is actually it's only a century old.
Okay, thanks.
But it looks terrible. Under the modern eye, you're like, why is there this big river after the period? It's terrible.
Well, that last line is weird because it's all compared to everything else. It's crammed together.
It's crushed in. Now, that is actually quite. I mean, I'm blowing it up a lot, but it's actually ironic that it's that badly spent. You can also see, even in the quotation marks are bizarrely wide too. Why is there so much space between the quotation marks? So, it's the example that proves itself. What's that?
Don't get me started on that one.
On quotation marks. Oh.
There's a long story. Anyway, go ahead.
So I was just going to show, this is an example of what linotype matrices look like. And you can see it's on the left is just one line of matrices with space bars, which I even have one. I have one of those I can show you. This is the great innovation of linotypes. If anybody ever asks you, is it's a wedge. So instead of when you're hand setting, you can pick a space of a different size you want to make a line to fill in the spaces. So if you have a loose line and you need wider spaces, but with a linotype, how do you have variable spaces? This was one of the great interventions is, and you can see this in the illustration, is the space bar or the space band, because it was a wedge, uh, as a typesetter would type out a line, they would hit a button to drop these space bars in like a space. And then when they were done with the line, they would know it was wide enough to be justified. They'd pull a lever, or it depended on the device, and a justification wedge, like an actual hydraulic thing, would come up and it would push the bottom of the space bar wedges up, which would make the spaces wider until the line hit the desired standard width. It was an incredible Rube Goldberg device, and it's why it was so easy to set justified lines on a linotype. But so you get all the benefits here. It has uniform set widths, it has a uniform point size, it has a uniform baseline, and you're getting the advantage of mechanization. On the right, I just included this illustration because this is the variety of kinds of matrices, the molds that a linotype could use ultimately by the kind of it's probably the 20s or 30s. There was a huge variety because there was a call for many different kinds of types to be used in composition for headlines and subheads, and linotype had to keep up with the times. They had a lot of competitors.
Yeah, I have a question directly
Yeah.
on that. Did the linotype spring up out of the blue? I mean, this is this amazing, as you say, Rube Goldberg machine. I mean, did it just one day, Morgenthaler, I think, invented it? Did it just show up and work? Or, I mean, were there many things in between? Or
Well, it's a funny story, which I won't. I can go into more at length maybe at the end too. But it's the 1800s. Everyone was trying to make a typewriter or a typesetting machine. This was kind of like from nearly the beginning part of the century. There was enough metallurgical sophistication and mechanical sophistication. So you have the Wright brothers, you have people making bicycles and then airplanes. You have people making typewriters, and you have people making typesetting machines, because all of these things, the typewriter and typesetting machine was about automation. Bikes were about transportation, right? A way to uncouple yourself from
and
a
sewing
horse.
machines, same
And
time,
sewing,
I bet.
yeah, sewing machines, right. So these are 4 of the big technological innovations, and you have all of these people tinkering in shops, and their shops, just like the Wright brothers shop, is where Ottmar Mergenthaler was working, and this guy named James Clephane wandered in and knew the boss in this shop, and eventually the two of them formed a series of partnerships. But Clephane was a celebrity stenographer, if you can believe such a thing existed. He was the stenographer to the stars. He was a friend of Lincoln. He was a friend of many presidents and statespeople. And because being a good stenographer was an incredible ability. So taking the notes and being able to transcribe it in a fashion that was then typeset for, court reports and the congressional records and so forth. And so Clephane had this idea that he wanted to create some kind of automated typewriting system. And he actually, Scholes and Glidden, or Scholes and Densmore, really the 2 guys who perfected the first typewriter that became the Remington, they would send this guy, Clephane, they would send him betas of their typewriter. And Clephane would destroy them. He's a Steve Maness of testing, definitely. He would destroy them in his use, and he would send back detailed, scathing notes about everything was so wrong. And they sent him 6 models. And by the end, Scholes wrote Densmore and said something like, "I can't deal with this anymore, it's too much." And Densmore said, no, he's our best critic. We can learn from him. We need to keep working with him, because that's how we perfect the typewriter. And they did, and it was sold in the 1870s. They sold the rights essentially to Remington. The typesetting machine, hilariously, so Clephane went on, he and Mergenthaler worked together for years to try to figure out a way that you could create a mold from which to cast type, because there were molds that were used for entire pages of type. So you would set a page of type for a newspaper by hand, then you would push a mold onto it using material called flong. There was this like wet, pasty mix of like blotting paper and tissue paper and so forth. And then you could cast an entire metal plate that would go onto a press to print a newspaper page. But Clefaigne wanted to bring that to typesetting, and so originally they were trying to develop machines that would punch like molds into paper, and then you would harden the paper. But eventually they broke through, and they were able to create these metal molds, that these matrices that could then form lines of type. And but it was before them, and even at the same time, Mark Twain, as you may all remember, or maybe not, that he famously went bankrupt financing a typesetting machine that was competing with the Linotype. His machine, the one he financed, was not terrible. It just broke down a lot. It may have actually been superior in some ways, but it wasn't reliable enough. And the Linotype, they could keep working. So the Linotype kind of won, and Twain went bankrupt and had to make a lot of personal appearances and issue new versions of his works. But so across the 1800s, different people tried to create ways of automating using individual pieces of type and having machines that gathered them or pull them together, and had keyboards, and people are working on typewriters and they're working on this, and some of the same people overlap, and then eventually you get Scholes and Denmore's Remington typewriter, basically, and the Mergenthaler Linotype. But I love the story because you just keep coming across the same people who are bashing their head against the wall against the limitations of manufacturing refinement of the time.
Glenn,
Thank you,
you,
Glenn. That's great.
you alluded to the sort of making of stereotypes, which goes to the rotary press. Did anybody actually use Linotype to not take that step and do the intermediate and then the metal cast for rotary presses? Were these used on flatbreads? Flatbeds.
Were stereotypes used with flatbeds?
No,
Oh.
was Linotype cast used on flatbeds?
No, because no, wait, I'm sorry, that's not right. That's true. I was going to show what Steve's talking about. Wait, actually, do I need to unshare her for a second? Let me see if I can do this. Sorry, my screen is, there we go. So what Steve is talking about, this is a stereotype. This is actually a stereotype of a Doonesbury cartoon from the 1970s, acquired off eBay. And so there's two parts. I want you to think about something close to hand. Wait 1 second. Oops. Sorry, I'm limited by the length of my cord. 1 second here. I always have handy visual aids. There we go. So this is a paper mold, and you can see it has depth, and this would be made for advertising. So when in the photographic era, you could take a picture of something like an ad copy, like someone drew a picture or you'd make a stereotype like this, which is would be etched from, you take photos of it, you'd etch zinc, and then you'd press it into paper as kind of a photocopy technique. So this thing called a flong is actually a reverse mold, or it's molded from metal. So this can then be cast by a newspaper. So instead of sending out heavy metal pieces, which are expensive to cast, you create a paper mold from them, like a mimeograph, basically, and you send this out to newspapers. Thousands of these for, like, this is a movie ad for The Lion. I don't even know that movie, but whatever that came out. And so you send out, as an advertising agency or a movie studio, you send thousands of these out to newspapers around the country. Then they essentially reverse the process. They pour hot metal into this and create a stereotype. They lock that up with a page of newspaper type. Then they create another mold from it in order to create a full page that they cast to print the newspaper on. So it's pretty elaborate. But Steve, they would do that for both flatbed printing, to create a large plate, or they would do it for cylindrical printing for the round newspaper presses, the high-speed newspaper presses.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
So if I may ask another question.
Sure.
If someone's putting out, a medium city-sized newspaper, not the New York Times, how many press operators and type operators and people that need to do every night, to get one of these things out the door? I mean, you're talking about a 50-page or 30, 40, 50-page paper, every line typed by hand and put together. And
it was a huge effort. I mean, Steve used to work for the New York Times, but I think you joined after the metal days, right? So you were, that was 1974.
I believe I did, but I've been in press rooms. I mean, those were highly paid union guys who were incredibly fast. And remember, I mean, I learned this the hard way when we did a book that shall remain nameless. there was a real premium on getting it right and being accurate, because making corrections in a line of type was a bitch. You have to take the whole line out and reset it, but it's only that line. And that's why they had proofreaders. We don't have proofreaders. That's why they had copy editors. We don't have any of that shit
That's
now.
right. It's all gone. It's all spell checking and
well, I mean,
typos found online.
the great technological story that no one, including the New York Times, dared to cover was the automation of newspapers, which is one of the earliest digitally automated businesses. And they were absolutely afraid to cover it because it pissed off their unions. I mean, they were in the background. They were just laying off people right and left, proofreaders, copy editors, and typesetters. And the joke is that now correcting errors is cheap. So, you just
right. They put out the first edition online and they wait for the corrections to come in and then they fix it before it goes in print.
Right.
There's a funny story I came across in researching this and other topics. There was a long-running. I will actually finish this presentation also, by the way, I promise. But there's a long-running union shop negotiated situation, which was when you could start making paper molds of type to distribute it. So you set type once, then you make 1,000 molds of it, right? And you send it all out. So that type doesn't need to be set by each newspaper. Well, the typesetting unions did not like that because that was 1,000-fold amount of type that they were no longer setting in-house. That was work that was gone. So any type in an ad that came into, say, the New York Times or any newspaper from the rise of flongs and this technique in the really towards the late 1800s, but it accelerated later. The typesetters were allowed to reset the copy and then throw it away. And I know this sounds like a terrible union habit, but it was also a way for the unions to prevent all typesetting from being done by non-union workers elsewhere. So it was this weird tension, but this was called bogus copy, and there was actually a Supreme Court case about it in 1954 because the management said this is feather bedding. This is an illegal habit, and the Supreme Court said it's not feather bedding. They're doing the work. If you're doing the work, it's not actually a violation of the labor law. And so this is actually the ability of our typesetters to reset or to be paid to not reset copy that came in from outside that was already typeset was affirmed by the Supreme Court. So in the 60s, newspapers started, especially in New York, started to switch over to CRT-based typesetting. New York Times was a late holdout, and there was almost a strike in the early 1970s about it. And what solved the strike is the unions agreed to give up this bogus copy habit and kind of wipe it off the books. They agreed to switch to CRTs and no longer oppose it. And management agreed to give lifetime employment to every printer working at the New York Times and one other company, I forget the other press, maybe the Post. Every printer and typesetter employed, but a lot of them were not say very old, sorry, not by today's standards. They were towards retirement already. They'd already worked 30 some or 40 years. A lot of them were waiting to retire, but the jobs were so good they couldn't. So they took huge buyouts. They shed their payroll. They switched to CRT computer-based typesetting, and the last person guaranteed lifetime employment in 1974 retired in 2016. Wow. He had started as a very young man and he retired in his 70s, I think it was, or a little older. And at the end, he was doing InDesign and page layout. He had gone through every transition in type from hot metal through CRT, through phototype and early digital to InDesign. So he had been working for 50 years, my entire life just about, I think, at the New York Times under a lifetime agreement. But anyway, these funny stories you unearth where you're like, wait.
It sounds like a movie, The Last Typesetter.
Yeah, I mean, most people, he was really the last by far. He was a very trailing edge, but it was a good deal for everybody because people didn't all get mass unemployment either. As I say, I promised I was going to move on. So I just love this example. I found this in the British printer from, I think this is the 1902 article. This is an entire page that's set solid, which means there's no spacing in this at all. This is all just the width and the height of the type that was set using standard widths. They're calling their unit set examples, standard line for the baseline, and standard points. And this is such a tour de force. This would be very difficult to do today, even with master typesetters, the people can still set by hand. And it was still an amazing feat in that day, even when this was at the peak of people's ability to set by hand. So you just see like every direction, all the numbers, the letters, tiny things, different sizes of type, ornaments, things running sideways. So this is kind of the apotheosis of that era. Is everything is standardized, everything works together, hurrah. And so I kind of close off here with the modern era. So now, what do we care about this, right? You know, this is some examples from Creative Market, did this nice little graphic of tracking, which is, if you're not a typesetting geek, tracking and kerning are not the same thing, although they often get used interchangeably in the literature, but technically, which is the best kind, being technically, maybe pedantic, is tracking is when you change the spacing for an entire range of text, and kerning is the space between two letters, any letter pairs. So, and you can also track 3 letters, so it gets a little, 2 letters, it gets fuzzy. But these are different kinds of ways of spacing the word Toyota. And you know, at the top, it's just spaced out a little bit. The next one down is just without any kerning, so you see the T is kind of sticking out too far. Then there's a tracking where everything's tightened up and it's too much. Then they're using optical kerning, which is it depends on if you're using software, it's the software trying to find a fit. If you're using your eyeballs, which I still will do, you're moving digitally letters together farther apart to make them look right. And the bottom is metric kerning, which is the widths built in to a digital typeface, about especially including exceptions for letter pairs like TO or YO, so that they're spaced correctly without any additional effort. So left-right constraints we don't really have. You have an enormous amount of freedom today. Type designers don't build strictly on a unit system, in that I don't know any designer who's like, yeah, I'm only using 13 widths across my entire face, but they definitely build things in a standard way so it's easier to maintain and reuse details across letters for consistency. We use fractional points now. We can use 14.13 point type in InDesign, but we're still relying on a point system developed 130, 140 years ago. And baselines are handled automatically, but we can adjust them at will also. We're continuing this notion of legibility that's focused on a baseline. The baseline must be a property of the brain, in the sense that either if you're going down on a line or going across, our eyes want to follow something that's stable. We don't want type going up and down and up and down. We want something to follow like that, left and right, or up and down and up. And so no matter what the president has brought us in terms of sophistication, we're still using a baseline. And then I'll I sort of finish with this, which is my friend Thomas Finney, who's a type designer. He's kind of got this radical notion that maybe we're in a post-point era, because he's like, if you're not using metal type, you're not using phototype even, what is 12-point type anymore? It's what you say it is, because there's nothing that you're really measuring against. The components of the type, some typefaces in metal days, the capital letters could be taller or shorter and be in the same type size, because you're measuring the whole piece of metal type, not just the character on it. And you could have type, I set a book recently in monotype Bembo, which is always, you talk about it being set small in the body, which meant that it seemed almost a point size smaller. So if you're setting 10-point Bembo, it was like setting 9-point in other faces. So Thomas argues, maybe there really is no such thing as a type size anymore. Maybe it's all optical. We're looking at it, it's a visual relationship. So thank you for letting me meander around about the history of type and make it modern. Here is some contact information for me and various URLs and other things. But Ken, I can do any questions. I'm sorry, we did a bunch of highways and byways there, but I can answer any other questions about that. Or if you got other tech questions about Zoom or other things, I'm happy to chat as people are interested as well.
But feel free, everyone. Feel free to unmute yourself and pipe in. I could probably ask questions for the next hour, but I'll start with one, which is, where do people learn about type as part of design? Do most people who are doing anything from newspaper ads to books to computer layout really know what they're doing?
I think so.
Where do you learn?
I talk to design educators, and they still focus on type as a basic thing. And so if you're getting a design education, there's who knows what the future will bring, but there's I don't know if I could tell you numbers, but it's clearly based on the number of instructors. I got a list of all of the people who teach design at a university level because I wanted to mail them all. So, so I got a mailing list, so I have a sense of how many people are teaching it. But it's clearly hundreds of thousands of people who are studying graphic design in colleges, universities, trade schools, and so forth nationally. So it's a pretty large audience of people who are going through some kind of formal training, and they may wind up in advertising or um, uh, newspaper design, things like that. I mean, there's all the digital design, of course, and digital design involves a lot of type knowledge. And my friend who sort of provoked this whole baseline research, he works at Figma, which is a very typographically sophisticated interface prototyping company. They make software that designers use to, sketch out and approve app designs, which then kind of move into production. And it's got a lot of the reason he asked me about this is they were adding more controls to make, I would say, more classical baseline options available to designers so that it was easier to choose how to align your, what baseline you were honoring when you were designing an interface. And that's kind of a neat thing. And so he said, how far back does this go? And I said, I don't know. Let's find out. Let's take the ride. And so they were doing something last year that really has its roots in the late 1800s and asking the same questions for a new medium. But I would say is all the design teachers I know, they all do focus on type. They focus on form and color and type and appearance. And so if you ever see anything that's ugly, clearly they didn't have a good teacher, right? No, that's clearly, everyone has different aesthetic opinions, but there is good formal design education that's feeding people into a lot of online work and app design and things like that. But also there's still a lot of print books made and a lot of, even though there's a declining number of publications, that's true in the US, around the world. In some places, print culture is vibrant, and some places, newspapers continue to persist, if not thrive, not just hang on.
Glenn, what is there an equivalent to baseline for vertically set type? I'm thinking of Asian languages, or like theater marquees, where you're running the thing down, up, down a vertical stripe, as it were.
I've never studied like Han languages, like Korean and Chinese. I don't know what the term is for that. I haven't encountered it typographically, and a fair amount of it is now written. I mean, it's more classical that's written up and down, or even classical typesetting. And because so much modern Chinese and Japanese and Korean is now set just like Western type, in lines as
But
opposed
you do
to.
see Japanese vertically too.
You do, yeah, absolutely. I don't know that there's a term for it, or I mean, sure, I should say, I'm sure there's a term for it. I don't know what the term
Okay,
is.
I assume it's somehow a vertical line that.
Well, I've wondered because centering as a whole is a controversy in the design world, because I had a design professor who basically threatened to flunk us if we ever turned in anything that had centered copy in it. He thought centering was the devil because he thought it has the worst of all worlds. You make a shape and the shape isn't related to what you're trying to say, and the eye falls off on the left and it falls off on the right. He's like, do something flush left or right or do something that indicates what you're trying to say. But with individual logograms in Japanese or Chinese, do you center those as it goes down? Are they all the same width? I don't know that answer.
Yeah, I just wondered.
No,
I mean, but in English, if you're doing a vertical set, is there an equivalent?
I've never encountered that. It's unusual enough. There's no, if you're using digital, I mean, I can't think, when I used to set phototype, and there was no term used there, and I can't think of a term in like any of the digital software I've used that was, I mean, because most of the time, if you're lucky, you had software to let you rotate stuff, and so you could, or you're setting. Do you mean the letters that are upright and down, or sideways?
No, I mean like on a theater marquee.
Oh, it's letter on top of letter on top of letter.
Down BROADWAY from top to bottom.
Yeah.
And all the kerning issues are different too, obviously.
Right, because everything. Yeah, I have never encountered a term for that.
I just wondered. Yeah, this is odd. Anyway.
Chris Webb was. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
The question for me, Glenn. What's your background? I mean, obviously you're a writer now, and but you said you've done some typesetting, you've done some design. How did you get started in with this fascination?
Oh, sure. When I was in high school, well, my dad was, I think I said at the outset, he was got an oddball job, not from his background. My family sold furniture. We were retail furniture people for many generations, and we moved across country, and he got a job selling display advertising. So he had to learn a lot about, this is phototype era. He had to learn a lot about typefaces and how to use them, and he taught me some of it, and I just sparked a bug. And when I was in high school, the high school paper actually paid the typesetter of the paper. We had an in-house, this is in the early 80s, but the district had, maybe for vocational reasons, it's not totally clear, had bought some late generation CompuGraphic phototype setters. Every high school, or 4 high schools in the city, every high school had one of these systems, and we produced the yearbook with it and the newspaper and other stuff. And so I got trained to use the CompuGraphic to set the school paper. I think I got $20 an issue, which is a lot of money in 1985 or 86. That was pretty good money as a high school non-delinquent. And so then I wound up working as a typesetter when I was in college. I'd this is still, it's funny, it's like I worked for a job shop that did magazine work and advertising work and some other things, and uh, I just kind of that led me into design. But I worked as a typesetter on and off for a few years, and I think I'm probably one of the last people who was formally trained as a typesetter. I mean, maybe not around the world, because typesetting continued as a separate thing. We kind of, moved into desktop publishing, and then there are still people today who are typesetters who do type refinement, but it's a very small number of people compared to people who do, say, layout. I mean, I think people moved into being page layout artists as opposed to strictly type designers or typesetters. So I'm sure. So you get trained in typography today. You might learn typography. You get a job, and you're doing setting. But I think I'm one of the last folks who got that kind of formal education.
Thanks. I want to mention that Christopher Webb just put something in the comments about Japanese typesetting. So
Oh, that's neat.
if you haven't seen it in the comments, you might want to take a look at that.
Yeah, Christopher's saying your great grandfather. Yeah, union typesetters. Yeah, the typesetting union was incredibly powerful because not that many people could typeset. It was a very particular art, and so if you go on strike, and strikes were very limited. There were only 3 legitimate strikes in the entire history of the International Typesetting Union, ITU, across 150 years or something. It was only 3 actual full-on strikes because they had so much power. They could do sick outs. You can find a story I wrote about the great Wildcat magazine typesetting strike of October 1919. Last year, I'd found this a couple of years ago from a clipping someone had put inside the cover of a book that got scanned by Google Books. And I found this clipping. I don't know what I was scanning through, and I read it, and I was like, why have I never heard about this weird typesetting strike? And it was kind of a wildcat action, so people walked out, but it was after World War I, and typesetters and printers were working at job shops where they didn't work directly for the publication they were printing. They were working for doing any kind of work, and a lot of it was magazine work. In fact, they wanted to raise. They wanted it was 50. What was it? It was 50/40. It was like a $50 it was $40 a week for 50 hours. I forget the detail. It was some very specific formula, and they wanted to raise because there had been a wage fixing during World War II. There was a wage fix board to prevent inflation while World War I rather. World War I was going on, and everyone had kind of waited it out. And they said, okay, now it's time. We want our raises that we put off, and we don't want to work a 48-hour week anymore. We want to work a 40 or I don't know, it was 44-hour week, or they were working 7 days a week. They want to work 6, something like that. And so they couldn't get a settlement. And so a number of typesetters just walked out, and they claimed they were sick. They're going fishing, and it shut down parts of the magazine industry for weeks because it was all centered in New York. And if you go into Google Books and you find any topic in October and even into November of 1919, you will find typewritten magazine pages, because some magazines decided, oh, we're going to get rid of all these typesetters. We're just going to type. We're going to do something called Callitpy. I think it was called. It was Callitpy. pretty typing, beautiful typing. And so they would use clean typewriters and very carefully type it out, and then it would be photographed and made into plates. They would print from that, and the publishers hallucinated that they would give up typesetting forever. Then the Wildcat strike was over, and you never hear anything about calotypy again for many decades. And then then typesetting became kind of broken down, became the phototype processes were invented, and the digital, but phototype wound up kind of breaking the unions ultimately, because a lot of phototype came into places where it was used outside of union shops, and ultimately that led to more type that wasn't set by union people.
Yeah, I just put a link to your blog with that article on it. I just did a quick Google on it.
That's the the typewriter is not a typesetter, for those who like the Robin Williams book of 20-something years ago about
that raised a question that I now don't remember. So press operators, that would be separate. So they had strikes too.
Yeah, although depending on the union structure, they may all be allied. So there were paper pullers, who were literally people who took paper off the press. It was a separate profession. Printers and typesetters, and by the early 1900s, those were all sort of separate professions. And but they might all strike together. I don't
Because the
remember. I think the
Washington Post
unions were
famously
separate.
had that strike in the 70s, right?
Wait, what's that? The oh yeah, it was which one? The Post, you said?
Yeah.
Yeah, is that in yeah, the New York Times, it was a 66, 67. There's a huge strike in New York City of newspapers for months. I think it was.
Yeah,
It
there
was
were a couple of
devastating.
them. There were a couple of them.
That was the big one. It was that was localized though, not national. I think they're all local. Yeah, typesetting was all under the thumb of a few unions in New
Now
York City.
anyone can do it. We're all amateurs, and it looks like crap.
Although what's funny is the guy who designs the New York Times homepage, right, or sorry, front page right now, he's got a Twitter account, and a couple times he's posted time lapses. He has a grid, a piece of paper, and he draws it out by hand. He sketches out what the front page is going to look like, and that's his first process. And I just thought it's kind of a wonderful thing. I don't know if it's the most efficient or smartest way, but they've done some really stunning cover or front pages of the print edition. Recently there's been some staggering ones, and he starts as drawings, and I just hard to believe, and it's awesome. Then he hands it off to somebody else who executes it, I'm sure, a fleet of people. But
Mimi, I see you've unmuted. Do you have a question before?
Oh, sorry, I just bleeped something on my screen. Wait.
Yeah, no problem. Because I can ask questions all night, so other people should jump in.
I have a question.
About making a mistake on the same task.
Mimi, we can't hear you through the paper.
oh yeah, the paper's blocking you.
Can't hear you, Mimi.
Oh no.
Can't hear you. What happened to Mimi?
Oh, we lost her? No.
We see her, but we can't hear her.
Okay, how's that?
Oh, there we go.
Right. Down here, there's the little bird, and they made a mistake, and so they put a little banner down here, and then they have the bird pulling it up.
Oh, that's awesome. What is that? What's that book? That's great.
This is the Gospel Acts of St. John's Bible, which was hand calligraphied
Oh.
years ago by the seminary. And the calligraphy is just amazing. I was looking to see what the typeface was, but I don't know. I wonder if they actually photocopied it, because I don't think there's a typeface that prints this calligraphy anymore.
No, it's probably, yeah, it's like a facsimile edition probably, right?
These big old picture books.
What's next?
They had the Bible here a couple years ago. I went to see it at the Tacoma Art Museum, and I was just blown away by the calligraphy.
Oh, I see. Yeah, because they'll publish a facsimile,
Yeah.
which is great. It's just photographic, but it'll look terrific, and you get all the detail.
Yeah, because I'm a friend of Ken's. I'm just wandering in here from
Excellent.
well, from this world actually. But I'm really pretty much a typeface junkie, and I really thank you. This has been very interesting.
Oh, good. Well, thanks. I have accumulated huge amounts of trivia about type in the last some research I've been doing the last few years, so it's fun to be able to talk about any of it.
Nancy?
Started alluding to the issue
Oh,
of
sorry.
wit.
But,
Let's let Nancy
wait.
talk.
Oh, sorry.
oh,
Yeah.
Nancy's mute. There we go.
My grandfather was worked for the last lithography business in Detroit, and
Mhm.
I only remember him bringing home images. But did they have a way of putting print on those lithographs?
Boy, that's a good question. I'm trying to remember from, did he work with, was he working with traditional lithography? Like, did you remember if it was, because there were, I mean, it was literally on stones, but then there was a metal process that was developed.
I can't remember. I was a kid.
It's, uh, there, there wasn't a good, well, let me see. No, I'm forgetting. There were techniques where you would set type in, you would set metal type and you'd create a transfer sheet. Oh, in fact, I can't pull it out. I have a, let me see if I can grab a picture handy. Um, I don't know that I do. I was gonna say I can't. I have a 40-pound piece of lithographic stone that that's behind me, but I don't think I can go grab it. Lithography is a process where you're etching in the original days, you're etching a stone. You're using a technique to etch a layer of stone away, and then kind of use a substance that would make parts of it attractive and parts of it resistant to ink. And so parts would attract water, parts would attract ink, and then you could press paper against it under high pressure and get these really rich, vibrant colors and really good transfers. So there were techniques where you would take you would set type on a letterpress, you would pull a print from the letterpress, and then you would create a transfer from that print onto a lithographic stone. So you could actually incorporate type. How frequently that was done, I don't know. I know, and sometimes they would do lithographic prints and then take the print and put it on a letterpress, depending on the circumstances. There are some really large format letterpresses. You could do huge posters. And I know the thing that I have, let me see if I can find a picture real quick. What I have is a transfer stone, which was actually, it was like step and repeat with a photographic camera. So they'd have etching artists would like letterhead items, like swirls and eagles, and they would inscribe like a copper plate hand style thing, and they would do it on this stone, and then they would just treat that one area of the stone, and they would basically pick the stone up and put it on the stone is like this, a foot and a half or 2 by a foot, and they would put it down onto an enormous stone that might be 4 by 6 feet, and sort of put it down and pick it up and move it over and kind of paste it more or less with treatment each time, and create a giant sheet of this repeating pattern for letterhead, put a huge sheet of paper down, print it by lithography with the stone, and then chop it into letterhead size pieces. But that was hand inscribed. 1 second, I think I've took pictures of this. I've been documenting as I go through the Type Museum project. I'm calling it the Tiny Type Museum project, and it's about this big. It's as big as a bread box, is my joke. And it's exactly the same size as a bread box. But I've been collecting larger artifacts. I was hoping, if the pandemic hadn't hit, I was hoping to do like pop-up big, the not so tiny Type Museum thing, and be able to go and bring type pieces like this lithographic transfer stone and other work that was too large to fit into a tiny case and show people. Oh, here we go. Let me see if I can share. Hold on, let's see. Can I do this? This is something you probably have never seen because it is very rare that people see this. I found one for sale on eBay that was very affordable. So this is,
Oh,
so I just find this totally fascinating. So each of these things you can see, there's marks all over the place. Those are registration marks for aligning it on the large stone. And just a little funny thing about, printing, when you're printing, you have to constantly be balancing right reading and wrong reading. So when you're doing letterpress printing, all the stuff on the bed of a press is reversed, because when you put paper on it, it's mirrored and it's right reading. So this stone, the first time I saw one of these a year ago at Letterform Archive in San Francisco, it's a great type archive of material, like a typographic library. It's open to the public. They had one, and I thought, why is this right reading? Because you're printing from it. Then after some research, I found this was a transfer stone. So it's right reading. You would then push it essentially onto a stone that you're printing from. So it's wrong reading on that stone, and then you pull the paper off, and then it's right reading again. But some beautiful, I mean, this is the level of detail these
oh,
engravers were working at. This is all done by hand. There were specialized machines for doing rules on these transfer stones, and just an incredible art. I mean, little
Whoa.
tiny cross hatching. It's, you know, almost invisible to the eye. That's just the side of it's a hunk of limestone. Um,
Wow.
anyway, I mean, this is from this different tradition. This is flat printing, planographic printing, and this is what became modern offset printing. Is lithographic printing developed? Uh, they moved from using stone to using metal plates, then eventually figured out how to directly transfer a photographic process. uh, Letterpress printed stuff, you'd print a proof basically, transfer it to a metal plate, and then print the metal plate onto paper. And then from there, eventually, you would be able to create the plate directly from phototype and then digital type. But it was this kind of herky-jerky process to move to flat printing. So the ink just rests like a little bit of a layer on top of lithographic printing. Um, it's not being pushed into the paper. It's not on raised surface. It's just some areas are oleophobic or oleophilic, rather. They like ink, and some are hydrophilic. They like water. There's the whole stone. It's got two sides too. Both sides are prepped and were used for different things, forms, and anyway, the whole thing is pretty wild. Cost almost as much to ship to me as the stone itself cost.
Could you talk briefly, Glenn, about your the Type Museum? I know it's a commercial project of yours, but I'm okay with you plugging it.
Well, I
Yeah.
appreciate it. I'll bring up. Wait, I have. So let's see if I can bring this up. This is just a drawer. Oops, I'm stuck in my curtain. This is just a drawer of it. There's a picture earlier. I mean, that's just some wood type I had around. But the idea is that it's going to be one. So the bottom drawer has basically all these goodies, like different aspects of typographic history. So, you know, for instance, here's a linotype mold. It's used for casting type, and this is a recently cast capital letter M from the typeface Albertus that was cast at an active type foundry run by this couple who live in Skaneateles, New York, and the Bixlers, and they've been casting and setting type for, oh, I don't know, 40 years now, I think, and they're still at it, and there's still some active type foundries in the world, and there's a linotype person who's been, this is actually set by someone different, but the linotype person who's been setting me linotype slugs. Technically they're intertype, it's a competing system. So technically intertype slugs with the same technology. This is a matrix used in the monotype system for doing display type, so different sizes of type, so you could cast a lot of characters at once. I'm trying to remember, this is the electrotype matrix, and if you look at it carefully, the fascinating thing is, you see there's like a brass colored inset. They would actually mill out the center of this larger piece of metal, and then they would use a process of electrotyping to chemically deposit this mold on top of a piece of type that was sticking through it. And then you remove the type and the mold remains. It's a really complicated and fascinating process, and it sounds, it's electrochemical. You would put this with wax surrounding it, with the piece of type or the positive image pushed through, and it would be in this tank for a few hours. And it sounds ridiculous and time consuming, and it was completely worthwhile for the manufacturers of type to do it. It was so much easier than other methods. This is a laser cut printer's fist, which was made by, I'll show you this name, by Scott Moore, who's an active wood type manufacturer he's in Ohio, and he does both traditional wood cutting. So this is, I don't know the mark on this, you know, this type is 100, you know, somewhere between 100 and 140 years old, G, of course, like my name. This is made in a traditional process in a wood type factory of that era. And then this is, you know, a wood type design that was cut by laser and is, you know, equally valid and usable on a letterpress.
Yeah,
So
so those hunks of the type of various types today, you'd be using those on the letterpress.
exactly. So these are all, and they're all, you can see, obviously they have it's relief type, it's raised. So the background has to be at a relief from the surface, and the surface takes ink. So the whatever kind of press you're using, or if you do it by hand, you're inking the surface, and then you use some kind of system. There's lots of different ones that press paper very precisely onto that surface. You're essentially, layering a film of ink onto this, then transferring that film to paper or some other medium, and kind of pulling it off the type, more or less. And that's how everything was printed from 1450 until the early 1900s, when lithography rose as a viable alternative to printing. But it wasn't even until the 1950s that lithography, offset lithography, really took off as a method. So almost everything in the world was printed for 500 years by letterpress. And there's still people. This is the SVC is closed now, but they're still or the press is closed. But SVC has classes, usually 2 classes going simultaneously year round, with 10 or 12 people in it, teaching beginning and intermediate advanced letterpress to folks who still want to learn how to use it. And there's thousands of places around the country, fewer outside the U.S., UK quite a bit, a little bit in other places. But it's a thriving kind of somewhere between hobby and passion and mild business for some people.
Going back to your mini museum, so that is a project where people can buy essentially a kit or a cabinet full of artifacts.
Yeah, it's just if I can grab.
And I should mention it's not cheap, but it's very cool.
It is not. It's true. I set a price that's so this is it's exactly the size. You can see how big it is, almost big in my head. Exactly the size of a bread box. And so there's that drawer I just showed you, and then a middle drawer with some flat items, and then a book goes in the top slot. And anyway, it's been a great project, doing an edition of 100 of these, and it gave me the opportunity to do all this research to learn about many of the things we're talking about today.
Is there a standard height off the bed for those pieces of type, so that you get them, so you get a flat alignment? Is that a standard that's worldwide or got adopted at some point?
It's actually, it's a great question. I was talking about all the standards and I forgot that one. It's called type height or type high, and it's 0.918 inches for reasons nobody has any recollection of. But it's fairly historical. Like, it's not, it doesn't date back hundreds of years, but at some point, it's the same thing as if you're trying to print stuff or you're trying to make presses for other people, you have to have a standard, because otherwise you're going to crush your type or it's not going to be inked at all. So when you're making all your own stuff, then you kind of have a variety, but it has to be tall enough that it doesn't fall over. So that's why type seems, it's almost an inch tall, and only a tiny relief. It's like a few hundredths of an inch is needed between the type and the background. And for bigger areas, you need a little more relief so the paper doesn't sort of fall over into the empty spots. But the type has to sit sort of strong on a body. It has a big shaft so that when it's pushed together under tension, it's held rigidly but not so tightly that it'll spring out. So it's all kind of, there's these things called coins. So here's actually one example. I always have something handy. This is a kind of coin, Q-U-O-I-N, and there's a slot there that when you put a coin key in, it's a wrench and it opens and closes it. So this expands or contracts, and it's used to basically wedge all your type strongly together. And what used to happen is, Steve, I'm sure you saw this, is people would set at a newspaper, they would set a page of type, and the thing might weigh 50 pounds, whatever, and they'd pick it up and the whole thing held together. So you had, 10,000, 50,000 pieces of type or whatever is on this thing, and you'd pick the whole thing up and nothing would fall out. It was all locked in place. I mean, if it was slugs, it was less, because the slugs are a little more rigid, but this is type has to be held, has to be planed flat, so the whole surface is as even as possible. It's all the same height, and it's under enough tension to keep it at that level of flatness without it bulging up or falling out. But other countries have different sizes. Russia is like 0.92, I forget, and like there's a German standard, so you can't, they talk about this all the time. If you're trying to buy type, there'll be people say, well, this is European height, or this is, British American height, and you have to be careful because you can't necessarily, some presses have a metal plate on the bed of the press you can remove so you can switch between, but you can't mix them typically.
Can you actually go back to a basic question? Can you talk about the difference between the typeface and the font?
Yeah, I mean, I have an opinion about this, and people vary. I typically like to think of I think this is historical in nature. It kind of varies. In the old days, before before you had the notion of, let's say, digital type or even a single master for type, like you would draw one letter and you'd produce it at different sizes. A font was a collection of type that was all the same size and style. So you'd have a drawer in a type cabinet, like one of these, and every character in it was the same. It was one font. It was a font of type, and it was all the same point size, the same style, like italic or Roman, and the same family. And at some point, this notion of typeface or typeface appeared. Like, there wasn't always the sense that you would use like an italic and a Roman were designed to work together necessarily. So you might be using one kind of Roman and using a different kind of italic, and it wasn't a family. Over time, families of type developed. He started talking about a typeface as kind of a similar design philosophy across all the different weights and sizes. And then as you move into the 20th, even the late 19th century, when I look at old type catalogs, they're really trying to sell you. They try to sell you Cheltenham. Hey, we have Cheltenham in 43 different sizes and weights and whatever. It's all Cheltenham, and it all looks more or less like it was designed to be consistent with each other. And then now, of course, you buy a typeface, and you might buy a package that has a bunch of different weights in it, but you're not buying it by size. I actually typeset a book. I letterpress printed it, but I typeset it digitally. There's a process in which you can take digital output and get these kind of rubbery photopolymer plates made, and they work on a letterpress. So I digitally typeset a book with modern digital type and printed it on a letterpress, which is what a lot of people do, because there's metal type can be very time consuming to set. You can get people to compose it for you in hot metal, and then it's very expensive and inconveniently weighs a ton or more if you're trying to move around any amount of it. So I used a modern typeface called Stickley, by a guy named Michael Stickley, not the furniture maker, and he had designed optical versions of his face. So there were four sizes, but they were or four versions of it in italics for most of them, but there was a caption size, a body size, a headline size, and a display size. And he'd made different variations so that at those sizes, the thicks and thins work better. So if you're trying to do type this big versus this big, there's different optical properties. So a lot of type you buy now, you buy one face and you'll do an 8-point version of it, and you'll do 48-point. The same design is just being blown up or shrunk. And that is not historically the case. Historically, every size of type was essentially separately designed or drawn, or accommodations were made when the design of type and manufacture of metal type became more mechanized. They actually incorporated the notion of thicker and thinner optical strokes based on the size. The Lynn Boyd Benton, who I mentioned earlier, he developed this whole pantograph system of tracing. So you'd make a big mold or a big pattern that might be 10 by 10 inches, I think. You trace over it with a stylus, and it would cut with a motor, very tiny, exact, parallel motion, but reduced in size. And he had a whole system that let you essentially, it's kind of like I want to say an Etch-a-Sketch, but you turn different knobs and dials, and it would essentially let you adjust optically based on the size of the type you're trying to cut. So if you needed certain kinds of, it wasn't just, this thickness is verticals are wider, but it was the relationship between a curve would actually be slightly different based on the adjustments that were made. And so this is pre-computer, pre-digital, pre-whatever. It's all purely mechanical. The joke about that system, I think it was called the delineator. The adjustable system he developed was only he and his son could ever actually figure out how to use it. It was so complicated, nobody else could actually make those adjustments. What's also funny is I've read that no one's been able to duplicate Benton's mechanical delineator in software. So you can't sort of simulate what his system did. I'm not sure if no one's ever tried. I'm sure they have, but it was such a complicated set of sort of nonlinear interactions that I don't even know that the original survives anywhere. So there's definitely type design systems that let you. There's this thing called multiple masters and variable fonts that are, multiple masters go around a while, variable fonts are the newer thing, and they let you set different kinds of properties, and you can kind of dial as you go, like, this is the bold version, this is the italic version, this is the thin version, and you can, as a user, you can dial it, or a designer, you can say, I want to hit these spots on it, and it'll make it thicker, thinner, wider, and so forth. So those exist as digital tools today.
And that raises a question I was going to ask. What drives people to be creating new fonts and new faces? I mean, it just never ends. There's 10 zillion, and tomorrow there'll be 10 zillion and 10. I mean, it's, could you talk about, what?
Yeah, I wish I knew the answer to that, because I think it's kind of like, why do people paint paintings as opposed to why do people make commercial decisions? Although, I mean, it is definitely commercial. Most people don't invest the amount of time to design a typeface and not make money from it, because it's such a huge investment of time. And there's a huge learning curve for most people to go from not designing a typeface, even if you know a lot of digital tools, to the many ins and outs of doing it. Excuse me. And I mean, type is a tool of communication, and tastes come and go. So one argument would be that type that was designed even 10 years ago might not fit the needs of today. I mean, you see that with digital, right? Like, as resolutions improve, the density of displays continues to improve. If you have a 450 pixel per inch display, does type designed for a 144 pixel per inch display actually have the same or correct properties? Or was type designed, originally, was type designed for print? Is that going to work on screen, was the big question. And it sort of did. And then you had Microsoft and Apple and other companies commission typefaces that were specifically designed to take advantage of displays and not and be very legible. And same thing, the Kindle comes out, and you have a lot of people design typefaces. Amazon commissions typefaces to be designed that maximize specific properties of it. So there's some of that, but I think it's taste. People are like, I needed a typeface like this and it doesn't exist, so I'm going to design one. Or I think there's a space in the market. Look at Gotham, which was designed by what's now Heffler and Company, one of the big modern sort of bespoke design firms. They do a lot of fonts that are available for general sale, but they do a lot of work for publications and others that are generally available. And Gotham, they designed Gotham, and it became the typeface of the Obama campaign. And then every political campaign that wants to feel like a certain kind of thing like Obama, they use Gotham, and that came out of nowhere. So was there a typeface like Gotham before? There are typefaces like it, but nothing that was exactly Gotham. And you look at an Obama poster, and there's a certain kind of feeling you get from it. And if I set that in something that was slightly different, you wouldn't get that same reaction. So there's a bit of that. Publications are always commissioning typefaces because they want something unique, and you'll see this online. Sometimes a website will have a whole new look, and sometimes I'm like, I can't even read that thing. What did they commission? This typeface is illegible on the screen, but they don't want to look like every other website out there, and spending some thousands of dollars, maybe tens of thousands, depending on how extensive it is a way to make yourself stand out with a unique face.
I've got one up on my screen. I don't know, can everybody see it? One of my favorites.
Oh, that's great.
Custom built for this music festival.
Oh, neat.
And, it's got the foot serifs and, kind of an old timey look. That's the only thing I've ever seen set. They don't even use it for the words music festival, but
that's funny.
But it's cool. I mean, they got their own thing.
It's great. And if you know a type designer, this sometimes happens too. Or they'll have there's a type designer I really always admired, and it's funny, I've met some of his family now. So a type designer in the 1930s and 40s who passed away in 1989, and there's one of his typefaces that was in metal that was never revived for phototype or digital. And I was emailing with an older type designer. He said, I did a version of it once. Here, I'll send you a copy of it. I'm like, oh my God. So it's not in general use, but I feel privileged to have limited access to it. But why should I care about a typeface that's 60, 70 years old that isn't in general use? It's like there's a certain kind of feel that no one's ever developed. This Pegasus face, there's nothing quite like it. So I kind of wanted it.
Oh, I was
a question. Oh, sorry. Go.
Oh, go ahead. I was going to raise the other issue of type. You talked about how basically point size in the modern world doesn't mean a whole lot. And what about width? I mean, you've got faces like Dwiggen's Electro, which Doubleday used for every possible book because it was the tightest setting. You could use fewer pages of paper for whatever crappy book they were putting out.
Yeah, that's
Yellow Pages famously developed their own font for exactly that purpose.
Right.
That was Matthew Carter, one of the best known type designers in the world. MacArthur Genius Grant awardee, and Matthew's designed type for every medium. He started as a metal punch cutter in the Netherlands, and he designed type for every generation. He's still designing type today in his 80s, and he was commissioned, it was by Bell, to do Bell Centennial, which was a CRT base. There was before digital type, there was actually systems that would paint it to a screen and expose it onto film, basically. So it was bitmapped type before vector type, and he was paid to design it because the typeface they were using for the phone books was not as efficient, and they wanted to switch over to CRT-based composition in, I want to say, the early 70s maybe, or late 60s. So he developed a typeface that was incredibly legible, worked within the technology's limitations, and was super compact relative to what they were using, because he could mess around with it. When you're doing it by, I don't want to say it's impossible to do it by hand, but it's a lot easier when you're working in an interactive medium to test ideas than if you're carving in metal and so forth. So he was able to create a very harmonious typeface that also saved them, I don't know, millions of dollars a year in printing costs. One of my design professors in college, Alvin Eisenman, who was in his 70s at the time, this is 30, I'm losing track of my age, 30 plus years ago. He said he was hired in the 50s by Reader's Digest to help redesign the publication. And what they said to him is, we'll cut a custom typeface for you if you want one, if you want to have a new face design for the publication, but anything you do can't increase the amount of ink used, because that's one of our biggest costs. At the time, Reader's Digest was, I don't know how many hundreds of millions of copies they published a year across their print edition. So anyway, it was just a funny thing. It's like, we'll spend this massive amount of money to have a custom typeface, but ink is the real concern for us. Have I exhausted everybody? Have we?
Great. I love it. I want to thank you, Glenn.
Thank you
thank
so
all
much.
of you who are quiet and let us noisy people ask questions.
Thank you for all the questions.
I did. I've got the recording of this. I will put it up with Glenn's permission. Up on.
Yeah, you got to chop out the Brazilian.
I don't know. I kind of like
interlude. A little bit of a little rudeness in there, I'm afraid. But.
A little rudeness. Anyway, it'll take me a little while to get around to doing that. Glenn, if you make your slides available online, or
I will send you a link to that
on SlideShare. We'll put that all there.
Great.
Thank you all for attending. Have a great summer. Stay safe. We'll see you on September 14th to talk about non-rectangular phones for non-rectangular people. And with that, is there any last questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks. It's a pleasure. Thank you, everybody.
It's great.
Thanks a lot, man. Great talk. Appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Really loved it. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Good.
All right.
I'll look out for your book. All right.
Okay.
Take care.
Thanks. Bye.
Good to see you, Chris. All right.
Yeah, good to see you again. Cheers.
Take care. Over and out, everyone.
Very cool. Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye. Sure.